All right, so in this explainer, we're jumping into a pretty radical reinterpretation of a famous prophecy. The source material we're looking at argues that the man of sin isn't some future dictator we should be watching out for. Nope, it's something else entirely, a spiritual dynamic that's been at work for centuries. Let's dig in. So let's start with the big one, right? Who is this anti-Messiah figure? This is the central question that people have been debating for, well, millennia. Is it a specific person, a political movement, an idea? Let's see how our source texts tackle this ancient mystery. This is the popular image, isn't it? The one we all kind of know. A charismatic world leader who just rises to power, deceives everyone, and sets himself up against God. It's a very compelling, almost cinematic idea that's really dominated the conversation. But the author of our source material says, hey, hold on, do not be deceived. And here it is. This is the core thesis that just flips the whole script. The source argues we shouldn't be looking for a single man on the world stage. Instead, the man of sin is presented as something much, much larger and, frankly, more insidious. The whole system of human-constructed religion that puts its own traditions and power above simple truth. So how does the author even build a case like that? Let's explore how these texts start to reimagine this prophetic figure, not as one guy, but as this ever-present spiritual force. This passage from the New Testament is really the foundation of the whole thing. Now, traditionally, it's seen as a kind of blueprint for some future crisis. But our source material takes this very same verse and uses it to point in a completely different direction. And here is the crucial point. The author highlights another part of that same passage, which says, the secret of lawlessness is already at work. The argument is, see, this isn't about some future dictator just popping up out of nowhere. It's about a corrupting influence that's been weaving its way through human institutions for a very, very long time. Okay, so if the man of sin is a system, what does it look like? I mean, what are we even talking about? Well, the source material gives us a pretty clear anatomy, breaking down its essential characteristics. The source really distills this system down to 3 pillars. First, you've got pride, which is where an institution becomes totally infatuated with its own splendor. Second, there's power, where human leaders start claiming divine authority for themselves. And third, you have trade, where spiritual truth gets turned into a commodity, something used for profit or prestige. To illustrate pride, the author points us to this prophecy from Ezekiel. Now, it was originally about a king, but the source applies it to any institution that gets corrupted by its own magnificence. It's like a spiritual sickness born from just admiring its own reflection in the mirror for too long. For the second trait, power, the author brings us right back to that key passage. The interpretation here is that this isn't a literal man sitting on a literal throne. Instead, it's describing any religious system where human leaders or councils effectively place themselves in God's seat, making up rules and demanding absolute spiritual authority over other people. And finally, trait. The source argues this is what happens when ministry becomes a career path for personal gain. Shepherds start feeding themselves instead of the flock, and truth becomes just another product to be sold. As this verse puts it so starkly, their stomach becomes their mighty one. So this all brings us to the central conflict presented in these texts. The author draws a really sharp line in the sand between what's called the synagogue of men and the true assembly. This slide does a brilliant job of showing the two opposing models. On the left, you've got the false temple. It's a visible, man-made institution that's all about seeking human praise. But on the right, you have the true assembly, an invisible, spiritual community built by the Spirit, made up of people the author calls living stones. The author uses this verse to define the alternative. The true temple, according to this view, is not a building or an organization at all. It's the people themselves. It's a community connected not by some hierarchy or tradition, but simply by a shared belief in the truth. So, what's the prophesied end for this system of man-made religion? The texts describe a pretty dramatic conclusion, a judgment by fire. Here we see the prophecy of the system's downfall. It's going to be revealed for what it truly is, and then ultimately consumed. But not by a physical battle, but by the spirit of his mouth, which the author interprets as the undeniable power of pure, unadulterated truth. And again, the author connects this right back to that prophecy in Ezekiel, and this is the key. The destruction of the system isn't some external attack. The fire comes from its own midst. It's consumed by the very pride and corruption that it fostered within itself. It just collapses in ashes from the inside out. So what's the ultimate message here? What are we supposed to do with all this? Well, it's not just a theological explanation. It's a direct and pretty urgent call to action. The final takeaway is really a challenge. The author is urging the reader to leave behind the systems built by men, all the traditions, the hierarchies, the power structures, and to instead go after a direct relationship with the truth, which is presented as the only path to real freedom. And that leaves us with a pretty profound question to chew on. In a world that is just saturated with institutions, organizations, and traditions of all kinds, this source material forces us to ask, how do we even tell the difference between what's truly divine and what's simply man-made? What does that distinction actually look like for us today?